Next, we will move to item number 6, which is the parking text amendment. The presenter will be Brian Clough. He's a principal planner, and we will have 3 public comments which will occur later after the presentation.
Good evening, Mayor Ortega, Vice Mayor Janik, and members of the council. This is Brian Clough with the city's planning department. I'll be giving you an overview of the parking text amendment proposed under 5TA 2020. Next slide, please. So to start off with a little bit of background, on February 11th, 2020, the City Council held a work study session to discuss parking in the downtown area in response to public concerns that many of the new developments that are being processed may not have enough parking, and that much of the existing public spaces are being used up by private businesses. At this work study session, staff presented a comprehensive overview of the existing parking conditions, programs, and parking ordinance requirements that are currently in place. As a result of the meeting, the City Council directed staff to look into a number of parking-related items. Additionally, staff received a citizen petition requesting specific changes to the parking requirements related to multifamily residential, hotels, office, and in-lieu parking, among other public parking-related concerns. Next slide, please. So this is a summarized list of the items identified by the City Council as a result of the February 11th work study session. Next slide, please. And out of that list of items, highlighted here are the items that are within the purview of the zoning ordinance and therefore are appropriate to address through this text amendment. The other items you see here that are not highlighted are parking management related items that staff will continue to evaluate. This text amendment is focused on the amount of parking that should be required for new developments to make sure that projects are adequately parked. There are some items such as enhanced wayfinding that you see on the list here that staff was already able to begin implementing over the last year by adding some signage and improving existing signage around the Museum of the West and Stagebrush Theater public parking areas. As conditions continue to normalize, staff will continue to evaluate and if asked, can come back with other recommendations in the near future. Next slide, please. So after the work study session in February of 2020, the Planning Commission initiated this text amendment to the zoning ordinance to address the specific zoning related items. That was in October of 2020. Subsequently, staff presented a draft of the proposed ordinance changes to the Planning Commission for feedback in March of this year. Shortly after the Planning Commission non-action hearing, staff conducted 2 virtual open house meetings, which were well attended. In addition to the public outreach meetings, staff made information available through our planning and zoning subscriptions, our case information page on the web, and notifications to our interested parties lists and advertisements in the newspaper. Staff also conducted individual outreach efforts as necessary and kept interested parties informed through email. Staff did gain a substantial amount of input from the community over the last several months. It is extremely difficult to summarize the input in a few sentences or even paragraphs. So we've made sure to provide access to our detailed public outreach summaries, including access to the full recordings of the 2 open house meetings and Planning Commission meetings. Those were available on our website throughout the process. I'm a little bit at risk of oversimplifying here, but what we've heard mainly from 2 distinct perspectives, those coming from many of the downtown business owners and merchants, and then those coming from the development industry. So a lot of what we've heard from downtown business owners is that more public parking is needed in Old Town and that new developments are not being required to construct enough parking for their demand. This has been geared mostly towards multifamily residential developments, office users in certain areas of Old Town, and employee parking for hotels. On the industry side, we've heard that trends and recent data support a reduction in the hotel parking requirements and that the existing requirements that we have for multifamily are sufficient. Next slide, please. So the specific request this evening is for adoption of Ordinance 4500, approving a text amendment to the zoning ordinance related to the parking requirements for these 6 items that you see on the screen here. So this is focused on travel accommodations, which are hotels, multifamily residential, office, and specific to call center type offices, downtown overlay waivers, in lieu parking, and some special improvement requirements. So as we discuss each of these items in more detail, it's important to note that the proposed changes reflect evaluation of existing projects and represent a balanced effort to reasonably increase specific parking requirements while also addressing some current trends. The text amendment is focused on the amount of parking that should be required for new development, with a focus on downtown to make sure that projects are adequately parked. Next slide, please. And before we get into the details of the changes, I wanted to go over a few fundamental policies that have been used for decades in guiding downtown parking requirements and management of parking in Scottsdale. These guiding principles are key when considering parking requirements and management of parking within the city. And staff's tried to keep these fundamentals at the forefront through this process. So first, we have maintaining free parking. So periodically, the discussion of charging for parking arises, but the city's always maintained the principle that free parking is essential to our downtown. Providing free parking also adds a dynamic to parking supply and management that can bring new challenges. Next, providing options and flexibility for small property owners to be able to reinvest in their property. Many of the properties in downtown, specifically in the core area, are more than 50 years old and on small lots. It's important to provide these property owners with options that they can acquire parking if they're not able to provide it on their lot, specifically in those small lot situations. Next is bringing more people downtown to support businesses. This is a primary function to promote the vitality of businesses and owners in downtown. Next, to promote efficient use of parking, recognizing that it's an increasingly expensive and valuable resource. It's important to make full use of what we have available. Providing parking within a reasonable walking distance while also promoting walkability with active street frontages can also help with that efficient use of parking. Next, acknowledgement that parking needs in downtown do exist and that we need to try to anticipate future needs without excessively overparking or underparking in the downtown area. Also acknowledging that events and circumstances like spring training, Canal Convergence, Art Fest, and other special events in the downtown area might create short-term parking shortages in some areas during those periods. Also considering revitalization and redevelopment as a potential source of additional public parking can be very efficient, and public spaces within a private project a lot of the time can be much more cost efficient than standalone parking. And then next here, behavior and enforcement or management. Sometimes the perception of a parking shortage in a particular area of town or at a specific development can be the result of convenience or management of the parking supply that's available on the property. So there may be more than enough parking for a specific demand. However, people may park in public parking spaces because they're more convenient than parking in the spaces that are available to them at their businesses or apartment building. In some instances, private garages may be occupied by personal belongings that are leaving no room for parking, or residents may park on the street for easier or more direct access to their unit. Whatever the underlying cause, it's important to acknowledge that more parking supply might not be able to solve every issue. Next slide, please. So now getting into the specific changes that are proposed within the scope of the text amendment. Travel accommodations is up first here. So within this text amendment, the proposal would reduce the per room requirement from 1.25 spaces per room to 1 space per room. There's also a performance requirement that's added on parking master plans that's specific to employee parking, as well as clarifying some of the requirements associated with conference space and auxiliary commercial uses and then an exemption for the first 5,000 square feet of those uses, which I'll go into a little bit more detail here. So generally, with regard to travel accommodations, there's been a number of changes in the industry that's resulted in reduced parking needs in Old Town for hotels. These include rideshare services like Uber and Lyft, bike share and scooter services, and recent trolley service improvements. These services have had a significant impact on parking demand reduction. Based on data available to the city, it's estimated that the current parking demand for hotel uses in the Old Town areas, in most cases, not more than 0.8 spaces per room. So the proposed requirement of 1 space per room also considers that this ratio is not limited to the Old Town area, and it also applies to hotels outside the Old Town area that are in more suburban areas of the city. So we anticipate that hotel uses in the Old Town area may continue to request parking reductions through a parking master plan, which is currently allowed by the zoning ordinance, and this would allow each of these to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis if they wanted to go lower than 1.0. There's also been concerns with commercial uses that may be included with a hotel development and the associated employee parking demand. The base parking requirement for travel accommodations is always intended to account for employee parking that's needed to serve the use. However, with requests for reductions in the amount of required parking, there's a concern that the demands associated with the additional commercial uses may not be fully addressed. So to help with that is a new performance requirement for those parking master plans that requires the parking analysis to specifically address employee parking, including employees associated with conference and other commercial space. This would also require that the employee parking be provided on site. And it's important to note that the demand for employee parking can vary substantially based on the type of hotel. For example, a limited service hotel will have a much lower number of staff per room than a full service or resort hotel. So the parking demand associated with employee parking would be reviewed as part of a parking master plan in accordance with industry best practices, and that would be on a case-by-case basis to account for those variables. So the text amendment also clarifies that the ancillary uses associated with the hotel also have a parking demand and an associated requirement in addition to that base hotel requirement. There's an exception included there, which allows the first 5,000 square feet of associated uses to be provided without any additional parking required. That's intended to accommodate models that cater to the hotel guests rather than those with larger facilities that would be anticipated to draw patrons from off-site. Next slide, please. So the next item here would be the changes associated with multifamily residential. So the changes here would be to add a guest parking requirement of 1 space per 8 units. That would be applicable citywide. And there's been some additional text added to address some of the recent comments received. So that requires that those guest spaces shall be located so they're easily accessed by the guests, and that would be as determined by the Development Review Board through that process. And then specific to the downtown area or the Old Town area would be modifying the per unit requirement to match the current requirement that's outside of Old Town. So you can see A, B, C, and D, what the current ratios are on the left, or I'm sorry, what the current ratios are on the right, and then the new ratio, which is consistent with outside of downtown on the left. So we have received a broad range of feedback regarding the requirements for multifamily residential. We're hearing from a lot of the Old Town businesses and property owners that the existing requirement does not adequately address the demand, and there should be an additional requirement for guest parking. Most of these concerns are related to the anticipation of future development impacts. We're also hearing from those in the development industry that the existing requirements are sufficient and they're not experiencing parking supply issues. So the proposed changes take many existing and approved developments into consideration and represent a balanced effort to increase parking requirements while addressing guest parking. The proposed per unit rate for multifamily in Old Town matches the existing ratio that's applicable outside of downtown, which on average results in an increase in the amount of required parking spaces. This is a ratio that has been tested throughout Scottsdale for more than 20 years and has worked well. For guest parking, we benchmarked against 11 other Valley cities, which average, excluding those that don't have a requirement at all, approximately 1 space per 6.3 units. Based on the unit mixes approved in many of the recent development in Old Town, the proposed unit ratio in combination with that guest parking requirement on average would result in a 15% increase in the required parking for a multifamily development in Old Town. And that would result in an average of 1.65 spaces per unit. And that ratio does exceed the parking supply ratio that's outlined in the ITE parking generation manual, which identifies a ratio of 1.1 space per unit for downtown cores. So it's more in line with a suburban model in which that manual calls for 1.6. The ratio is also in line with what the Urban Land Institute ratio for multifamily residential units in a suburban setting would call for. So over the process with this proposed ratio, there has been scrutiny over the requirement for 2 and 3 bedroom units being reduced slightly from what's currently allowed in Old Town. So you can see C and D there, the 1.7 and 1.9 for 2 and 3 bedroom units, as opposed to the 2 that's currently required in Old Town. So, there is a possibility that a development that had a 50-50 split of 1 and 2 bedroom units would potentially result in a wash there. However, based on the information that we've seen and looking at 12 of our existing multifamily developments in the Old Town area, the average unit breakout's closer to 63% for studio and 1 beds, and then 33% for 2 and 3 beds. So what we see in the industry is typically those are heavier towards the studio and 1 bedroom units, which would result in more spaces being required. And then on top of that, you'd have the guest parking requirement of 1 space per 8 units. Next slide, please. So the third item here is office, and this would be specifically towards call center, higher demand type offices where you have a lot more employees in a certain area. So we've heard concern regarding these office business models where we have call centers in areas that may have been standard office before, and they're much more intense than a standard office. There's many other jurisdictions that already have a separate category for these types of office uses, and the industry standard generally seeks to provide 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet. So our existing requirement is 1 space per 300 square feet, and that would be increasing to 1 space per 200 square feet, which is in line with the anticipated demand. Next slide, please. So getting into now our downtown overlay. So the downtown overlay was created in 2003. At that time, there was a need to simplify parking requirements, and there was a need to stimulate revitalization in the Old Town area, particularly encouraging second-story additions and residential units above retail. So this is an option that currently allows a property owner to add up to 2,000 square feet of commercial floor area and up to 4 dwelling units to a lot without additional parking being required. The downtown overlay also simplifies the process of determining parking requirements for existing properties. So the proposed change here are strategically reducing the scale of what a property owner can do by reducing the waiver to 500 square feet of commercial space addition and only 1 dwelling unit. So it's anticipated that limiting these waivers as proposed will reduce the strain on public parking over time in the Old Town area, and more specifically, a lot of those smaller properties on Main Street. Next slide, please. So the fifth topic here is the in lieu parking. Started in 1985. Similar to the downtown overlay, the in lieu parking program is intended to provide an option for many of our smaller Main Street type properties who may be in a non-conforming situation and are unable to provide parking on their site. This program allows them to make small improvements to their property without parking being a problem that they can't overcome, and to do that by purchasing parking credits from the city. So you can see initially the cost of a space in 1985 was $7,500, and that was based on surface parking. The current cost of a space today is just over $14,000. So that's pretty far off from the actual cost, which is closer to about $45,000, and typically in a structured format. Historically, the program's received a lot of scrutiny since there's not a physical space associated with each credit. However, over time, funds received through the program has resulted in a significant amount of new parking, new public parking. So since the program's been started, about 496 in lieu spaces have been sold and permanently credited to properties. Over that time, about $2.9 million was generated by the program, and that money was used in capital projects to construct approximately 855 spaces using those in lieu funds. Next slide, please. So the proposed changes to the in lieu parking program would be to eliminate the option to purchase new permanent in lieu spaces and leaving leasing as an option. And then also adding a new property size limitation of 20,000 square feet for those that can participate in the program. So the concept behind getting rid of purchased in lieu spaces is to eliminate the creation of those permanent parking credits. The lease option would still bring money into the fund for use on parking. However, the parking credits only applied to a property for as long as they need the space, and then it would go away. The proposed limitation on property size is geared towards the intent of the program, which is to help smaller property owners that don't have room to construct parking on the site. And if you have a property that's greater than 20,000 square feet, you'd have a few more options to work with than a property that didn't have 20,000 square feet. Next slide, please. So the last topic here is the special improvement requirements. So the proposed changes to this section of the ordinance are related to providing public parking as part of a private development. This is applicable for developments that are requesting bonus development standards, such as height, density, or floor area, through a zoning district map amendment. So there's cost associated with those bonus development standards, which are required to be dispersed through special public improvements. And public parking within their development is one option to disperse those funds. So this change would provide an equal credit for above ground parking that has enhanced design and below ground parking, thereby increasing the probability that a property owner or developer provide public parking within their development. So this is already an option. The main difference is changes to how the funds would be credited. So currently, if you were doing above ground parking using this program, they would only get 25% credit of the actual cost that it would require to construct the parking. So this would equalize that with below ground parking and allow 100% of the cost that it actually takes to build the structure to be credited as part of that special improvement program. Next slide, please. So on April 14th of this year, the Planning Commission reviewed the proposed text amendment, and after in-depth discussion on each of the proposed changes, they did recommend denial of all the proposed ordinance changes except the special improvements requirements section, which they recommended approval on that section. Their motion passed with a vote of 5-1, and the Planning Commission wanted to forward on with their recommendation the discussion on each of the text amendment sections, which provides the basis for the action that they took. So these discussion points are detailed further in the staff report, but I've tried to highlight some of the key points here. So the commission agreed that many of the concerns are valid and changes to the code may be necessary. However, a parking study and analysis is crucial to confirm the proposed changes will result in a sufficient parking supply. They added that the scope of any study should be specific to each of the topics that are included in the ordinance changes. Then they also commented that Scottsdale and its demographic is unique and are not easily compared with other communities' parking demands, and Scottsdale-specific data would help define these specific needs. For hotels, they commented that employee parking needs to be based on peak demand, and administrative reductions should be limited to 10%. Next, the commission expressed concern that changing the requirement for multifamily residential, specifically the 2 and 3 bedroom units, to 1.7 and 1.9 doesn't seem appropriate. The guest parking for multifamily residential is important and must be accessible to the residents. One space per 8 units may or may not be enough, and more data is needed to confirm the right ratio. And then generally, the in-lieu parking is a good program, but the cost should be representative of the actual cost to construct a space. And there should be a physical parking supply associated with the sale of in-lieu spaces. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, parking in Scottsdale has many different components, and this amendment's not intended to address all of the complex parking issues in downtown Scottsdale. It's focused on the amount of parking that should be required for new development in downtown to make sure that projects are adequately parked, and the proposed changes reflect evaluation of existing projects and really represent a balanced effort to reasonably increase parking requirements. Parking needs are largely data-driven and trend-driven, so requirements should be further evaluated periodically to respond to those future changes, maybe in future trends and growth. So that concludes staff's presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the council may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clough. At this point, I think we will have the public comment on item number 6, and then move forward with any questions that the council may have before we take a motion. So let's turn it over for, there are 3 requests for comment on item number 6.
Thank you, Mayor Ortega and members of the council. This is Shane Stone from the City Manager's Office. Our first public comment will be coming from Mr. Thompson, to be followed up by Ms. Kirtley. Mr. Thompson, you should now be able to press *6 on your device and begin your public comment.
Good evening, Mayor Ortega and City Council members. Our desire to improve the requirement for parking with the multi-family developments is to mitigate future damage to overflow parking. I seriously urge you to not delay this and wait for a study. That's a delay tactic that's used by the developers and by city staff. I urge you not to do this. I would increase these parking requirements right now. This is for the future of Scottsdale. The staff's recommendations are not nearly enough because they're compromising in favor of the developers. And I really have a hard time understanding why they're favoring the developers over the existing businesses that have been here and are on the ground. I can tell you these are issues. When city staff says developers won't come in, it's evidence with the Kimsey that good developers will provide enough parking for their tenants and the guests and their employees. By increasing these parking requirements will make the staff's negotiations so much easier with the developers, because in the planning meeting, Randy Grant basically just said every developer wants to have a waiver on parking requirements, and the city staff has given it to them 100% of the time. So at the Kimsey vote, the city council had some statements and showed a few things. And one of the things that I noticed was that Councilwoman Millhaven said she was listening to the surrounding people for the Kimsey development, that they were in favor of it. I urge you, Councilwoman Millhaven, to do the same thing for us. We gave you a petition a year and a half ago almost of 130 names requesting that these parking requirements be increased. So by not doing this, you're going to be undermining the confidence in the city council and the city staff. And right now, I just don't believe that it's a good thing to be undermining the confidence when the general plan is coming. So I urge you to take action now. And if you want to do a study, do the study later. But you can make changes back. But this is for the future of Scottsdale. This is very important right now. Please do not delay this and kick it further down the way. That's what the developers want. It's a delay tactic. We all know it's a delay tactic. So I urge you to take action now. And thank you for the time.
Our next public comment will be coming from Ms. Kirtley, to be followed up by Mr. Pedjamin. Ms. Kirtley, you should now be able to press *6 on your device and begin your public comment. Ms. Kirtley, it looks like you're unmuted, but we can't hear anything.
Does that help?
We can hear you now. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor Ortega and honorable council members. My name is Sonny Kirtley, and I'm on the COGS Board of Directors. Our address is on file on Thompson Peak Parkway. COGS is totally in support of the excellent parking code recommendations you've received from the 100+ downtown business owners. They need city council support to solve the serious negative impact of this current parking code ordinance. COGS has 3 quick topics and 3 related questions to share with you. Number 1, several years ago, the currently outdated parking code has not required enough on-site parking spaces for tenants in apartments and condo complexes. COGS shared pictures with the planning commissioners last week. It showed tenant cars parked on city streets outside the totally full and gated parking lot. These tenant cars spilled into adjacent residential neighborhood streets, and the city solution was to set up permit-only parking on the public street after specific hours. Now, as you can imagine, it just spilled into other areas in other neighborhoods. Planning commissioners agreed that there is insufficient on-site parking in many already approved multi-family complexes. So ask yourself question number 1. If many current multi-family developments didn't provide enough tenant parking, where will the guests park? Now, the consequences in Old Town is when this overflow parking happens adjacent to our businesses, the revenue suffers because customer spaces are filled by those tenants and their guests. Number 2, some office employment centers and hotels charge parking fees, which is our current code does not allow. Employees simply take up public parking garage and public city street spaces to avoid the added cost. So that question number 2 is, where is the city enforcement? My final question number 3 is, why would any city consider paying thousands of dollars for a 2021-2022 parking study? This is a totally abnormal pandemic economic plan. There is no value in hiring an outside consultant to perform 21-22 downtown parking or even citywide study. So in summary, COGS encourages this city council to support these appropriate business owner recommendations for an updated parking code 2021. Why not? City council can make any needed changes later if a 2023-24 study validates or invalidates them. Think about that, please. Thank you.
And our next public comment will be coming from Mr. Pejman. Mr. Pejman, you should now be able to press *6 on your device and begin your public comment.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Ortega, council members. My name is Bob Pejman, address is on the record. So a few weeks ago, the majority of the planning commissioners acknowledged that our parking code is insufficient, but they couldn't advise the council on the right numbers. But then how can they vote on the new projects going forward, knowing that the existing code is under parking them? But tonight, the council has an opportunity to fix the parking code and fix this problem. So right now, our current parking code for multifamilies is 1 space for 1 bedroom, 2 space for 2 bedroom. The proposed text amendment is changing the 1 bedroom up in it to 1.3, reducing the 2 bedroom to 1.7. It's essentially a wash. Nothing is gained. We need to increase the 1 bedrooms to 1.5, since many of the 1 bedrooms have couples living in them with 2 cars, and then leave the 2 bedrooms at the current 2 spaces. Also, right now, there's no guest parking requirement in our code, which is absolutely absurd. Guests and visitors exist, and they have cars. Also, downtown Scottsdale is not an urban area, since it doesn't even have a grocery store, and makes everyone car dependent. So when looking at the other valley cities that require guest parking and then eliminating the ones that are in dense transit-oriented urban areas, the average guest parking per unit is 1 space per 4.5 units. But then we have to factor in the guest parking demand for tourism. Unlike all the other valley cities, downtown Scottsdale is a major tourist draw. And so our definition of guest parking needs to be expanded beyond the occasional visitor and to account for people that come and stay with somebody for a week to visit Scottsdale and spend money and generate tax revenue. Having said this, why would we require anything less than the valley average of 1 space per 4.5 unit? Now, I've heard staff say that if we require too much parking, the developers won't build here. But let's look at the Kimsey project. The developer offered 1 guest parking for every 4 units. They even went over that. Not only didn't they go anywhere, they probably knew that with insufficient parking, they wouldn't be building a quality project. But not all developers are quality developers, and if they built our existing code, the projects will be severely underparked. Now, on the hotel parking, the 1 space per 1 room, in my opinion, is sufficient, understanding that it includes designated employee parking spaces. But with a 20% staff reduction, which is granted every time, we're watering down the 1 space per room to 0.8. And then with the newly added 5,000 square foot exemption for the dining and conference uses, the cars from those uses would then cannibalize and reduce the guest and employee parking spaces to an even lower number. So I urge you to either remove or reduce these exemptions. And lastly, I hope that the council votes on these items tonight. A non-decision is a decision that will affect thousands of new apartments. Thank you.
And Mayor Ortega and members of council, that concludes public comment on this item. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very good. At this point, we're closing public comment. There may be some questions from council to staff and clarification requests before we make a motion. So does anyone show any comment or question? Well, then I have several. But I see Councilwoman Caputi mentioned has a question, may have a question.
Yeah, this is for staff. So I have a bunch of questions, but we'll all take turns, I imagine. This is a pretty complicated topic, as we all know. There's something in the new ordinance that mentions the standards for providing on-site parking shall apply at the time of erection of a main building or when on-site parking is applied. I was having a hard time understanding that language. I'm definitely going to need someone to explain that. I feel like that timing would be really difficult. We would never know exactly when building construction would begin. Maybe it should have been something like standards for providing on-site parking shall apply at the time of issuance of the building permit for construction of the main building or construction of the on-site parking, but even the time of issuance of a building permit to me would be problematic because the design would have to be completed before the issuance of a permit. So the developer would only be able to start design if they knew what the required parking would be, right? I think a better time for parking requirement determination would have to be at City Council approval of the use or the zoning of the proposed building, because the use would determine the parking requirements, right? I mean, we're talking about needing to change for like a call center versus an office, but how would you possibly know the use of the building or who the tenants are going to be? The way it's worded, it sort of doesn't make sense to me. I don't know how that would ever be enforced. So that's my first question. Thank you.
Mayor Ortega, Councilwoman Caputi, it's a great question, and it is one of the difficulties, particularly when we have a building that changes use. And the reason that we tie it to the building permit is because at the time of building permit, we know exactly what the square footages are for each use. We know how many units are being requested, and that can change from the time of council approval. It can be modified a little bit. They may actually change from a retail to an office component, which would affect parking but wouldn't affect the overall zoning. And so that's why we tie it to the thing that we feel the most comfortable with as a commitment to what is going to be built on the property.
But then how would we address that issue of a space becoming a call center, like what happened with the Galleria, where if you approve parking for an office building and there's no way you would know who the tenants were going to be at that point, and then you've got a problem later, how would we address that?
At the time that they come in for tenant improvements, we evaluate the number of the amount of square footage that's being requested and the type of occupancy that's being requested. Clearly, we can't anticipate when a shell of a building is approved how it might be divided. But at the time of tenant improvements, we do see those plans. So it makes it a little bit difficult if somebody comes in with standard office space and then divides it into a call center. That's why we've tried to anticipate that and make the parking requirement for the type of office use that's being requested. But I won't tell you there's not challenges when a use changes and a property owner may need to acquire additional parking, construct additional parking, or provide other arrangements such as in lieu or remote parking for that use. And that does happen. We don't have a way to prevent that from happening, but we accommodate it as best we can with the permit.
Okay. Can I continue asking questions, or do we? Okay.
No, continue.
Okay. In the hotel question, why do we have a different requirement? Why don't we have a different requirement for Old Town hotels versus like the Four Seasons in far north Scottsdale? I know that for me, if I were going to be traveling and visiting a hotel that was nowhere near anything, you might need to rent a car, but certainly if you're going to be staying in Old Town, you know, I can't imagine that you would bother. So it does seem weird to me that we have one requirement no matter whether you're in Old Town or outside of Old Town. What was the logic behind that?
Another great question. The hotels can vary widely whether they're suburban or urban, and it depends a lot on whether they're focusing on a business traveler, in which case you don't have the same size rooms, you don't need the same amount of meeting space, you usually have a small coffee bar instead of a restaurant, or whether they're going for a resort type of facility. What we have seen and what is happening nationally is that in urban hotels, people are generally bringing Uber or other ride-sharing services in, and it is more common for resort hotels to have people driving in or have rental cars. So we could make a distinction between downtown and out of downtown. The result, if we tried to do that, probably would be downtown would require less because of the ride sharing. We think it's an appropriate balance to consider hotels in general, and then to look at the amount of conference space, the amount of event space in determining additional parking requirement.
Okay. That comment that Mr. Pejman made that I've heard several times before about we're a tourist town and therefore we would need more parking, that seems like a really strange comment to me. It's my opinion, and of course a lot of this is all anecdotal and conjecture anyway, which I'll comment on that in a minute, but it would seem to me that if you're a tourist, you'd be very happy to park once and walk around the city. I think it would be the exact opposite. Does the data not bear that out, that a tourist town would actually require less parking? Because, I mean, you're going to park and walk and be a tourist. I can't remember being a tourist in any city and wanting to drive from spot to spot to spot. I'd be curious to see what the actual data says about that. Do we know anything about that?
I don't have any data available, but I do remember back to when the construction of the couplet was being proposed, and that was to take transient traffic away from downtown and then provide parking so that people could come in, park, and walk. And so it certainly is reflected in the desire to move through traffic through more efficiently and to provide opportunities for tourists to come in, park, and walk.
I think that Scottsdale is a very unique city, and that's all the more reason why we really need to have data. I mean, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that comment that not having data means that we're kicking the can down the road or that we're delaying things. I think that I don't understand how you could make a decision this important without having factual data to base our decisions on. So I'll let some other folks talk, and I'm not saying that I don't necessarily agree with some of the changes that we're making, but I do think it's very strange to make decisions that have real consequences for everyone, just sort of because a group of folks feel like we don't have enough parking or it seems like things are kind of crowded at certain times. I agree with the Planning Commission's comments that I just don't know how you would possibly make a citywide ordinance without having factual data that relates to, an actual documented parking difficulty in particular areas. So I'll be curious to see what my colleagues say, and I've got a couple more comments, but we'll rest there for a moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Durham.
Thank you, Mayor Ortega. I have I think a number of comments that you could address after I'm done. These are more comments, not necessarily questions. As Ms. Kirtley mentioned, I was sort of surprised to learn when we got into this that there are so many places that allegedly charge for parking when this is supposed to be free. I've heard numerous stories about the W charging for parking, also the Galleria. One of the stories is people don't want to park in the Galleria and pay, so they move over and park in the 3rd Avenue, 5th Avenue garage. And also that there are some apartment buildings which charge for parking. If this is true to any extent, it really throws off a lot of our assumptions. For example, when we were looking at the Kinsey, we had a parking study which was based on the W's parking experience. But if any of that experience is based on charging for parking, then that really throws off the assumptions about what hotels need. On the hotel, I think we're moving in the right direction, but the 5,000-foot exemption to me is way too large because 5,000 feet would accommodate a good-sized restaurant, I think. And so if you have a 4,500-foot restaurant and you're not taking into account the parking that would be needed for that, that seems to me problematic. So I think we should be specific about what type of space would be subject to that requirement, and it seems to me it'd be bars, restaurants, business spaces, convention spaces, et cetera. We need to aggregate those, and I think we need a considerably smaller exemption than 5,000 feet. Also, I think I'd rather set pretty clear rule on the hotel allowance and not indulge in this 20% allowance anymore. The council could look at that as necessary and take advice from the staff, but I think we should eliminate the normal practice of the 20% allowance. Regarding waiting for data on a parking study, I don't really want to wait. I think we need to move, but I think we probably need to move incrementally. I'm not sure that we're ever going to get a good set of data which gives us a clear answer. There's an old joke about the definition of a consultant, and that's someone who takes away your watch and then charges you to tell you what time it is. So I don't think that parking consultants or data is really going to answer the question very clearly, and we're not going to be able to do that for several years because I don't think the situation's going to settle down clearly enough after COVID. And of course, things are changing constantly with Uber and other services. And I'm concerned that next year is going to be a very, very big tourist year because tourism appears to be coming back. I think that spring break and the other events of next spring I believe, are going to bring a lot of people here. And so I think we need to deal with this sooner rather than later. And I don't think we can wait for a parking study, but by not waiting, I think that means we need to make smaller adjustments, which we can adjust down the road. A few other ideas I had. The guest rule, as we've stated, it would require a guest parking spot for a small development, for example, one with 6 townhouses or 6 units. And so possibly there should be an adjustment for very small developments, such as 6 townhouses. I'm not sure that they would need a guest space. And possibly there should be other adjustments for smaller developments. I'm not sure what those would be, but I think that's something that possibly ought to be considered. And I agree with what many people have said, that Old Town is unique, and that's one of the reasons I don't think any parking study is ever going to tell us the answer on what exactly is right. And we do have to rely on the experience of people who live there and work there to a very large extent, more than we would than from some generic parking study. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Whitehead.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to remember all that others have said, so I'm not repeating. First off, I think that I agree with Councilman Durham that we do want to move forward, but I think that we need to break apart the text amendment. I'm not making a motion yet. I'll see what everybody else has to say. But I think the timing to make decisions on hotels, the timing to make decisions on in lieu, and some of the overlay, and certainly office is not now, because I think things could change a lot over the next year or two as we fully come out of this pandemic and see what that other side looks like. And so I would be very interested in doing a text amendment for residential, multifamily residential, and I do have a couple questions, and then attacking outside of the text amendment some of the items that are identified in this list. For instance, looking into, enforcement, as Councilman Durham suggested. If there's enforcement, and again, I've spent time in the parking garage of the Galleria, and it is empty. So 4 flights, this is pre-pandemic, the 4 flights were empty. I spoke to the president of a company that was paid by Yelp to shuttle Yelp employees from a public parking garage at the library to Yelp. So you have to consider, and multiple times, this is a shuttle that was running quite a bit during the morning, quite a bit in the evening. So you have to consider the cost that Yelp was paying for that shuttle service and wonder what is the cost that the landlord of the Galleria is charging the company. And if that is, in fact, in violation, just solving that one issue could change the parking situation that we have in that very large part of downtown. So I definitely think enforcement needs to happen before we make changes to hotels and to office, and then wait for post-pandemic where we really see what workplaces look like, and then give staff time to do other things besides enforcement. Look at shared paid parking component for events, improving our trolley service for events that connect people that are going to a game with the parking garages that we already have, and also looking at strategic partnerships with the private sector. So I think there's a lot of steps that the city staff can take that will completely change our view of the parking situation downtown. But I think that one component that won't change and does need to be updated sooner rather than later is the residential. And I do have a question on non-downtown. Can staff repeat what the parking requirements are for multifamily outside of the downtown?
Councilwoman Whitehead.
Mayor Ortega.
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, I'm sorry, Randy. Mayor Ortega, Councilmember Whitehead. So outside of downtown, those ratios are 1.25 for a studio, 1.3 for a 1-bedroom, 1.7 for a 2-bedroom, and 1.9 for a 3-bedroom.
Okay, but and sorry, I kept getting confused. So, but the current downtown is one for studios and 1 bedrooms, but 2 for 2 and 3. And then in your numbers that you gave in your presentation, the average guest parking requirement is 1 to 6 point something for in the region?
Yes, Councilmember Whitehead, based on the 11 Valley cities that we looked at, after taking out the cities that don't have a guest parking requirement at all, the average of those that do have a requirement was 1.63 per unit. Or sorry, 1 space per 6.3 units. Okay.
So, and I think, there's a lot of talk about our downtown being unique. One thing about it being unique is it's pretty big. It's I would like to see more walkability. I'm certainly always promoting that. But, I was here this weekend with my kid, and we were in one part of downtown. And honestly, to get to where we wanted to go on Fifth Avenue, we got in the car. So we are still car-driven. I guess I would favor... I think that's interesting that it's 1.25 for studio, 1.3 for 1 bedrooms. I would favor something like a 1.3 for studios and 1 bedrooms, but I really hate to lose the 2 parking spots for 2 and 3 bedrooms. And then I would like to see our guest parking at least be with the average. I would say 1 to 6. I know that the Coalition of Greater Scottsdale was recommending 1 to 4. I have talked to a lot of other businesses that didn't favor that, and I think I'm willing to compromise, but I think the 1 per 8. I've spent too much time visiting friends, and I just can't park. And they tell me it's stressful. They want to just have a little dinner party maybe once every 3 months, and they have to completely stress out about which parking lot can they tell their friends to park in. So we absolutely have a guest parking problem, and sadly there's so many townhome communities, so many communities that are already built where people don't have the ability to have guests over, and that absolutely hinders the property values of that. It reduces the property values of that community, and it makes Scottsdale less livable. So I'm very motivated to do something with guest parking and something with multifamily tonight, but I think I would like to take administrative action on some of these other items and kind of bump out these other items in this text amendment until we have a more normal more normal time to gauge what we need. Thank you.
Well, I've been involved in as an architect in Scottsdale for over 40 years, and a comprehensive parking review and ordinance change is very significant. And I think we do have to draw from experience to look at what conditions actually occur. So I have four basic areas that I'd like to approach here. The first one is the use or definition of the word mixed use. And mixed use is defined and encouraged in the downtown, and it's defined as, I believe, it can be residential, commercial, office, more intense, let's say restaurant, any mix of those, but at least two of those is the definition in our code. The problem that we have, and if you look at the schedule parking table, it mentions mixed use several times, mixed use, in different conditions. However, there is no minimum. If there were two uses in a mixed use, let's say commercial and residential, the glossary does not specify that one of those uses must be a minimum of, for instance, 20%. In the case of Canal Side, their so-called mixed use and use of that term, it was 98.2% residential and 1.8% commercial. They only had 900 square feet in a over 50,000 square foot project. That is not the definition of mixed use in my book. So I believe that we have to start with that, and I believe that the definition of mixed use in the case of having two or more, of two, that there at least one of those uses should be at least 20%. There becomes such an imbalance in the code by writing that. For instance, that project could have been 50 square feet of commercial, could have been a vending area. And that is not the definition of what mixed use is intended, or is it the common use practice of projects. So I believe that there's two areas that where this can be addressed. One is in the glossary, where you have the definition. I believe Mr. Clough could read that definition to us, but I think that any motion that comes forward has to clarify that, because again, it could be 99.9% residential and 0.5% commercial, and it would actually meet the test of that. I'd ask for Mr. Clough to look into that. I believe in the glossary it could be defined further. So that's important. The other thing is the term employee parking. I don't see employee parking in the glossary. I remember the old code from '78, and there was certain requirements for restaurants, and then they would take the area of the kitchen and they would divide that out and say, oh, and you have to have 5 or 6 spaces per kitchen, because that was calculated out. So I believe that, again, in the glossary in some form, it should have that. So those definitions right now are not spoken for. And I believe that this is our opportunity to do that. So I would look for a motion that would include those two so that they could be defined. The other thing is that in speaking to the use factor, so with office use, with residential use, with restaurant or bar use, there's an intensity of occupancy and use. Yet it's all bundled together in one car per 350 square feet in a mixed-use downtown element. The old code said 1 per 50, right, for a bar or restaurant, and all that got washed out somehow. And when in fact, if you have an office use generally, you actually have a high employee ratio, let's say. Their employee ratio is high, maybe their visitor ratio is low. Whereas if you had a high use a restaurant, you would have, a pretty good number of employees, but then the visitors have a higher ratio in terms of who's using that. The other areas in between will vary, and the old code said, of course, for a art studio, it was 1 per 800 because they had larger pieces, and the code recognized those things. For the Galleria and that question of changing the 1 per 350, that's on page 16 of our report. It's shown in our submittal. Why 1 car per 200 I think is the right move, and it's shown as the proposal. It's a start. Right now we have the Galleria was originally going to be commercial with little or no other than a management office. That's what it was used for. Then it shifted to office, and then now a more intense use. I believe their use for a call center has been washed out by COVID, and somebody will have to come back and submit on that. So in this case, unless they have a continuous use that's grandfathered, it would still we would still require or could inspect that they have to comply with the code. The other factor has to do with the hotel designated parking space, again, for employees. Now, the problem with that is, although we've been quoted, the industry will say, we have only so many people bringing their car, driving here, and then requiring guest spaces. Is there a study to say how many employees Uber to the hotel to work or take Lyft? Of course not. So when the rationale is used, because of Lyft and Uber, we don't need as many car spaces, that doesn't change the challenge of having, supervisors, managers, and so forth that is required. So when you look at the reduction to 0.8, that, in my opinion, is totally unacceptable based on the criteria of interviewing. You can interview guests, say, did you drive or not? But it doesn't change the number of people running their banquets, accountant, and then if they throw in a restaurant, that's also another area which is not accounted for. What this leads to is a very awkward situation. The awkward situation is that if it's not written in the code and the glossary and accounted for, then we have to pull teeth in a development agreement and do this tug of war and somehow have to build that in. Or if it's overlooked, then, the developer may say, we got off scot-free. So simply saying that it's bundled in a study, and sure enough, the study asks for 20% administrative reduction. So when you combine that, I believe that for the hotel, having a reduction of to 0.8 is, I would grant that per room, but we still have a 0.45 for employees. There's one employee for every 4 occupants, one way or the other. So it's still going to be 1.25 on the count. If we actually recognize that we don't have ghost employees, You know, it's one thing that we can enjoy a restaurant and be very sociable and have an attendant take our order and all that goes great. But then you realize, and we may have a nice tip, right? I mean, that's courtesy and everything. But then you realize that person that's attending for you is struggling to find a parking space and may have squeezed you out of that space. And that's a very common repetitive thing. So it leaves us without on-site parking. That's really the liability that you get when you build a project. It's not the city, then it becomes the city's problem. We have the people running around with chalk lines and chalking tires, and all of that ends up being a burden on us. So I would definitely recommend that that there always be an employee component, right? When you're on a cruise ship, it's like 1-to-1. There's one crew member for every passenger. That's what it takes to run a ship. And it's amazing. Sometimes they have, 1,000 employees with all they've got for every 1,000 people on board. So the hotels must provide on-site free parking. This point has been brought up. I brought it up last week as well, that what's happening is if you go to the website, the W will say it is $35 a night for parking. Have a great time. And the Marriott has a $20 charge per night. Now, for some people, they even whether it's free valet or not, that's going to discourage anyone, even a visitor coming, because only room key people get to go past the gate. So all of a sudden, all of those factors are cumulative and start to burden the small businesses and the traffic that we have. So that is, let's just say, prima facie evidence that the hotels are not providing free parking, and they are also not providing the employee parking that's required. And when we have those examples over and over again, it's not empirical. I saw this when the Galleria first opened in 1990, where we actually had employees at the restaurants, parking on the street on Fifth Avenue, going in for a 3-hour shift, and then leaving. Right at rush hour, right when all those things were happening. So I would say that it's not just an enforcement question, it's that there is not surplus parking in the hotel business. Why? Because they must provide it. Now, it's very quantifiable if it's a remote resort where there will be, no adjacent properties to park at, and they must park and they must be accountable. I remember when the Princess first opened up, they ran charter buses for employees out of Phoenix, and that was their solution to make that parking, to get the labor that they needed. The final thing has to do, so we've got hotel, we've got mixed use, we've got the Galleria, and then we've got the apartment guest parking. Basically by saying, one bedroom would require 1.25, that's on page 15. And then the other ones were, up to two spaces for a 2-bedroom. Well, the 1.25 seems to allocate for the users, and I also agree that we should have guest parking. And I think the comment was made, it should be either, whether it's behind the gate or in front of the gate, it has to be accessible to the public and visible to the public. So I saw that notation, but then again, I was looking for it in the ordinance. So I think what I'd like to do, by the time a motion comes forward, I'm hoping that I could get some assistance with staff to look at these areas that I've just mentioned, because I think those have to be, they're deeper conditions that are not addressed so far in what we've seen through the process. Right now I see Vice Mayor Janik wanting to speak.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. First of all, I spoke with a prominent development attorney in Scottsdale, and he said to me, if the development committee sets the standards, the developers will meet those standards. And I believe that to be true. And I feel that it is time for us to set the standards now with all the future growth that we anticipate as COVID ends. I do not feel that we need another study. The data from any study is fluctuating rapidly, if not by day, by month, by 6 months, because COVID is still evolving. There are still fears, there are still challenges. We are still meeting those fears, meeting those challenges, but that data will not be stable. So to me, a study is simply a way to kick the can down the road. I also believe what Mr. Pejman said, that no decision tonight is a decision. It's a decision not to move forward, not to face the challenge, and not to agree to adequate parking for the various areas that we've been discussing. I feel that it is a very, very large task to try to cover everything tonight. What I would like to see is that we were limited to multifamily residential and hotels. And the other thing that I think is important is, yes, we all want less cars downtown. Yes, we all want people to bike. But you can't force it by limiting the parking. Usually people revolt when they're tried to force to go in a certain direction. So these would be my comments. Thank you.
Councilwoman Littlefield, and then we could return to Kabudi if you like. Councilwoman Littlefield.
Thank you, Mayor. First off, I'd like to acknowledge this is an extremely difficult, complex, and convoluted question that we're trying to solve tonight. And I would like to personally thank Mr. Grant and his staff for all the time and work that you have put into making this presentation for us, a review and the update that has been needed for a long time. And I really appreciate your efforts to put it all together for a presentation tonight. Thank you. First, looking forward from where we are today, I believe the people who will come to our downtown to stay in our hotels and rent our apartments and our condos, to a major extent, will continue to drive their own cars and will want to have personal transportation where they are confident that it has not been contaminated by others who may have had COVID or any other virus that could come along over the next few years. Our attitude has changed over the past year, and I think this has been proved because cars across the country are being purchased in record numbers, higher than ever before, and that's not going to stop. Whether they will require electric fueling stations or continue to use gasoline is independent of the fact that they will need a parking space. So I think we need to take that into account. Things are changed. I don't think they're going to be the same as they are currently right now forever, but they are not going back to what they were before either. There will be higher demand. There are many moving parts in this parking ordinance, and so I cannot in one night go through and solve all the problems. I'm sorry, I wish I could, but I can't. But I would like to outline what I see as the basic problems in the current code. First of all, I agree with what people have said up here tonight on council. I think their comments are very good and very accurate and very much to the point. My comments are as follows. Our parking ordinance says that parking is free in Scottsdale. I assume this means that all city-required parking by hotels, apartments, condos, businesses, etc., is included and should be free. Therefore, by definition, only the parking spots over and above those required by our city code can or should be charged for. Our current code does not require any guest parking. This is a huge deficiency. A requirement for guest parking needs to be added. And currently we do not enforce free parking code. Therefore, we need to establish, perhaps with the assistance of the affected businesses, an easy, effective, and inexpensive way to enforce our codes. This has been done in many other cities. There's no reason why we can't do it also. Many hotels use temporary color-coded tags to hang from rear-view mirrors that signify customer-owned or employee-owned vehicles, and it allows them to park in appropriately designated spaces, which are also color-coded so they can match. Simple things can cause a lot of problem disappear. Clearly, much of our free on-street parking is being appropriated by employees who either cannot afford or do not want to pay for parking as demanded by their employers. Enforcing our laws is critical. This is especially true for our Fifth Avenue area, where the parking spaces are full before the stores even open. By enforcing our free parking criteria, I am hopeful that we can relieve at least some of the problem, congestion, in this area. I believe this will help promote both returning customers and will bring in new ones as word spreads. It would be a huge benefit over time for our downtown businesses. And finally, the merchants who are most directly affected by this issue have told us over and over again that the parking codes we do have are not sufficient to meet our current needs, especially when considering all of the construction that is built in downtown since these codes were created. One of the best ways we have to protect and help grow our downtown businesses is to ensure that their customers and shoppers can park easily and in close proximity to the stores they wish to visit. That's pretty much common sense, especially in the summertime. So, what do we need in our downtown parking code going forward? The merchants themselves have told us specifically what changes are required to bring us up to date with current needs. We received hundreds of email input news brochures from them, and they were consistent in what they said they needed. We do not need another parking study to see the problems and know how to address at least some of them. And we certainly cannot afford any further delay in fixing a problem which has been festering for years and which gets worse with every new development. I do not have the answers to all of the problems and all of the questions of parking in our downtown. I wish I did. If I did, I would give it to you. I do have, however, a suggestion for some of it. For multifamily housing, studios and one bedrooms, 1.5 unit spaces per unit. 2 bedrooms and up, 2 spaces per unit. Guest parking, 1 space for every 5 units. An additional, includes additional family members, employees, repairmen, guests, etc., that may be coming to them, including even possible customers if they have in business at the residential housing unit. Guest parking outside of downtown, it should be the same as downtown. It should be fully accessible and located outside of any gated area. In other words, it should be free. Hotel parking, keep to current levels. However, do not remove the exemption for dining and conference space. Folks that attend conferences will need parking too, unless the hotel intends to allow only their guests to attend conferences or dine in their restaurants. However, the 5,000 square feet should be reduced to a lesser amount. More realistic number, perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 square feet. Employee parking, it should be required and include parking for additional employees associated with any conference or meeting facilities and additional commercial uses. All employee parking must be provided on site and should be free. For office, no change for the general office. I think 1 space for 300 square feet is quite adequate. However, we should add the staff-suggested call center space of 1 space for 200 square feet gross area. We should include free parking for all employees as per our code for all of this space. And again, it could be done very simply, very easily, and there shouldn't be a problem with it. In lieu parking, this one is hard for me. I just have a hard time getting my head around in lieu parking. My car doesn't fit in it. But we could eliminate the allowance for any new permanent in lieu parking credits, and we should add in the code a maximum lot size for any business that is applying for new in lieu parking as determined by staff. and it should be only available to small lots without the ability to put spaces on their own properties. And I think your 20,000 square foot limit is quite a good place to start with that. Also, we should keep our promises to businesses for the current in lieu parking spaces that they've already paid for. This, I know, does not solve all of the problems. There are many, many other issues and many, many other areas that we need to address. But I do have a couple of other comments just to make in general. If the current code doesn't require free parking in apartments, condos, offices, and hotels, we need to change the code to specifically include that. Parking that owners may provide over and above the free ones that are required by code could be charged for, but should be physically designated as such. Staff should not have the ability to unilaterally negotiate a reduction of the required parking from the city's required parking code up to 20%. This significantly changes the terms and the conditions of a project and puts it in a non-conformance to our code. Any such request that materially affects the conformance of a contract to our city codes should have to be shown as such and submitted to council for consideration and vote. I believe the overall goal of the new parking text amendment should be that all new and revitalized developments should self-park and not be cannibalizing public parking to meet their needs. Whenever that happens, the actual net effect is that the public, our citizens, are paying for and subsidizing the development's parking needs. And that, to me, is not acceptable. And I do have an ordinance request when everyone else has had a chance to speak or talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Millhaven.
Thank you. We've heard a lot tonight about the business owners. We've heard two of them speak tonight about the parking requirements or concerns about parking, and this is a conversation that's been going on for many, 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 many years. I am, since we're speaking anecdotally and from personal opinion, it is my personal opinion that we don't have a parking problem downtown. We've seen many, many studies over the years that show that we have more than adequate parking all throughout our downtown, with perhaps the exception of the northeast quadrant that people refer to as the entertainment district. It's interesting, Randy used the expression was park and walk. I was talking with somebody about this today, and it's like we want a walkable downtown, but we don't want to walk it. We want to be able to park in front of the store we want to go to. I had occasion to go downtown a couple of times in the last few weeks, and one day I parked at Rose Garden and walked to Schmooze, and another day I parked at the Fifth Avenue parking garage and I walked to a restaurant a block or two away. So, we talk about a walkable downtown. It is going to be park and walk. It's not going to be parking right in front of our stores. I have heard, and I did hear one of the speakers said, listen to the stakeholders. I have heard from stakeholders, business owners and property owners downtown that said, I wish we had a parking problem. And that their concerns are that by increasing the parking requirements when we don't have a parking problem today will really dampen investment in our community. So if we're going to be anecdotal, I'll tell a story about I've been to several events at apartment buildings and never had a problem to park. I was at a community event with in a community room, and some of the residents of the apartments downtown told me, gee, my car lease came up and I decided to see if I needed a car, and so I turned in my car and I bicycle where I need to go, and if I can't bicycle there or I have to get too dressed up that my bicycle won't suit, I Uber, and oh my gosh, I've saved an awful lot of money. I'm not leasing a car and I'm walking around downtown. So, I think that my experience anecdotally is we don't have the problem, and my experience anecdotally is that people are moving away from cars. I disagree with the statement that says there's a higher demand for cars. I also disagree with looking at what other cities are doing right now, because I feel in many respects that's looking backwards. I think things are changing very quickly now, and we need to be looking at current trends and looking at what moves forward. So I would agree with my colleagues what I heard from some of my colleagues was a desire to look at multifamily and hotel. What I would say there, so I'll limit my remarks to that, assume that the rest is off the table for the moment. If we are going to revisit multifamily and hotel, I do think that we need to look at downtown separately from suburban. And I would like to have more of the data that the staff used behind making these specific recommendations so I can get more comfortable. Although, as I said, I don't think we have a problem today. The other advice I would give to my colleagues is that it's been my experience if we try to really tweak the finer details of an ordinance from the dais, we wind up spending a lot of time and not getting really good policy. So what I would suggest is perhaps we narrow down the focus of what next steps might be and ask staff to come back with revisions that reflect the comments that were made, or perhaps shop the council for additional comments before we come back to a public meeting. So, because I did hear lots of detailed tweaks folks want to make, and I'm not sure that's best served doing that from the dais. So thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Councilwoman Whitehead, and then Councilwoman Caputi.
Okay, so my comments are changing a little bit based on Councilwoman Milhaven, and that's fine. I just wanted to identify again before, and perhaps the best idea is to go back to staff, but bring this back really quickly with some of the comments, because I agree that we have a lot of questions. It seems to me, and perhaps Councilwoman Milhaven is in disagreement, but it does seem that there's a lot of unity on the dais about residential, but there are a lot of questions about hotels. For instance, should exemptions be based on square feet, or should it be based on function? So a lot of questions on hotels and based on the timing. So I would not at all be comfortable moving forward with changing anything on hotels. The mayor brought up an excellent point. We left off an entire definition of a category, mixed use, and that's a problem a couple places in our code. So that's it. I mean, I had some different ideas, but I think what my colleagues said is that we still need to direct staff and then come back. But I would hope to focus on residential separately from the others, possibly mixed use. But I just think there's too many variables right now with hotels and with the other items on the list, in lieu, and the idea of allowing smaller property owners to develop apartments and added retail without parking. I would rather not touch that one right now either. So I'm really focused myself on residential and possibly mixed use and looking for more definitions and to narrow down the other categories. Thanks.
Councilwoman Caputi.
I think there's a lot of great things being said up here on the dais tonight, but I keep coming back to what Councilwoman Milhaven said. I think so much of what we're talking about is anecdotal. I mean, comments were made about people are buying way more cars. I mean, I've heard people say that the reason car sales are up is because the inventory was choked during COVID, and then there's this sort of backup and no cars to be had. That if you're trying to rent a car in different cities right now, there's actually a problem because there's no inventory post-COVID. So I've also got numbers from Sky Harbor showing rideshare usage has been through the roof since COVID. So the theory of maybe people don't want to be in a germ-filled car doesn't seem to be bearing out when you look at the numbers. People are actually using rideshare in a far greater amount than they ever have before. So that's defying expectation. It's just conjecture. I talked to the CEO of Bird, the company that brings scooters into our downtown, and they told me today that they're averaging 750 trips a day in Scottsdale now since COVID. I mean, that usage is way, way up. So people are looking for ways to park and then get around our downtown in a better way. Of course, we can't force people to do that, nor should we be forcing people. Well, we should never force people to do anything. That's not our job. But this idea of, a certain group of people thinks this and a certain group of people think that. We have that a lot up here. We've said it many, many times. We all talk to different people. A few business owners called in tonight. But I've spoken with many other business owners who don't feel that we have a parking problem, as was brought up. I've heard from many hotel owners who've said that projects that they recently built might not have been built had we required them to have too much parking. So there's always this balance between, you know, keeping everyone happy, and we want residents happy, we want business owners happy. There was this, I feel like the callers were pitting, you know, evil developers versus our residents, and I hate that attitude. We're all here, we're all living in the city. We need every part of that equation for our city to be productive and to be in balance. We want everyone to be happy, but the point is, of course you're going to skew numbers based on your own personal conjecture, because that's your own experience. So I don't understand where the fear is about actually knowing the numbers before we make a decision. I'm hearing this, that's kicking the can. I don't know what this sort of don't trust the experts attitude is coming from, that I keep hearing. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. Scottsdale is a unique city, and we do need to have parking data that's specific to our city in order to make a good decision here, because it is important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't move forward. Maybe we should move forward incrementally. We've all expressed some agreement on certain things that are certainly problems, and we could do small fixes. I agree the world's changing, and we certainly don't want to get stuck with a fix that is permanent and then we can't adapt to. I think that if we do a study, we need to involve experts who are familiar with our city specifically. We need to be asking people in each quadrant of our downtown, all of the stakeholders, not just people from the arts district or certain merchants, but all of the merchants and business owners in our downtown need to be a part of this. And we need to understand the COVID impacts. And yeah, I mean, maybe we move forward incrementally, but we absolutely can't move forward in a big way blindly. That seems completely ridiculous to me. I don't know where the fear of a study comes from. I don't see that as being delaying. I think we can do both of those things together. And then I also just want to throw out there that we did just pass a bond, right, that included some parking. So no one's really mentioned that. Maybe we should throw that on the table as well, as long as we're all having a conversation, because maybe that's an option. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member Durham.
I think we're probably pretty close on the multifamily housing, enough that we can get something done. But I don't think we're that far apart on the hotel. I think the hotel issue needs to be broken down into rooms, and we figure out how many spaces per room or per key. And then we also have to look at the staffing, which can be very different in a limited service hotel versus a luxury service hotel. So it seems to me that the answer to hotels is to figure out the room number, the key number, and then work with the hotel to figure out what their maximum staffing and employee numbers are going to be. And then also look at the spaces they're going to create, whether it's hotels, whether it's restaurant, bar, business services, or so on. And then do some calculations for that, probably specific to each hotel. And maybe this goes into a development agreement. Maybe there's no easy way to do it other than getting specific numbers from the hotel, working those into a development agreement, and getting commitments to cover the maximum employees at any one point in time, using all those places, the hotels, the restaurant, the bar, the business services, and then also to account for the number of guests that'll be at those places. So, we may need a different calculation for every hotel, because the hotels and their services are quite different.
Thank you, Councilmember Milhaven.
Let's see if I can't help move things forward. Since it sounds like most of my colleagues are interested in hotel and multifamily, I'd like to make a motion to direct staff to do some additional work around parking requirements for hotels and multifamily properties. That would include recognition of differences between downtown and suburban locations, as well as hotels of differing formats, perhaps business traveler versus resort formats. I did hear from Councilwoman Caputi. She's still interested in a study. If we were to do a parking study, what would we study and what would the answer be, the question we'd want answered? So maybe a little bit more context about what that study might be, what it would tell us, what it might cost. And then perhaps in working on that, we might also include briefings with council members to make sure we've captured all of their concerns and thoughts. Because I heard lots of stuff about allowances and parking master plans and things like that. So perhaps as staff work too, they could make themselves available for individual council briefings to make sure that none of the folks' concerns have been overlooked.
Well, I will help in that discussion. Our discussion is as posted on an ordinance, and we have three choices: approve, deny, or continue. So having a secondary motion about whether or not empowering the staff to come back with a study is not on the agenda for.
I'd like to ask the city attorney if my motion was in order.
Excuse me. I'm just trying to say that it may be what you're suggesting is that you're not ready to vote yay or nay, and you're more interested in a continuance. I say that because that's how it's being posted. This is another sub motion, which is not necessarily, in order. As I'm trying to explain in a friendly way, that it sounds to me like you're not prepared to. You would like more information, and you're not prepared to vote yay or nay, and you're more in favor of a continuance with more information. Now, that's not the way you stated it, but that's why I don't see a motion for that purpose of empowering the staff to come back as necessarily where we're at right now. Let me get to Councilman Littlefield.
Before you can, I'd really like to hear
please,
from the city attorney if my motion is in order or not. Thank you.
Mayor, members of council, that motion in reality is a motion to continue with direction to city staff to bring back an item with the changes and or discussion of the topics that you included in your motion.
Thank you.
So accordingly, I didn't hear a second anyway, and that motion was not a continuance motion directly. Let me ask for Councilwoman Littlefield. I'm not saying you can't come back or reconstruct. Councilwoman Littlefield?
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to make an alternate motion.
No, you have to make a main motion.
Oh, okay.
You have to make a main motion there's no alternate, there's no motion on the floor.
Okay, I'm sorry, that's right. Okay, I make a motion. I move to adopt ordinance number 4500, amending the City of Scottsdale zoning ordinance and resolution number 12141, declaring the parking text amendment legislative draft as a public record with the following changes to resolution number 12141. In table 9.103A, in the section beginning with, quote, travel accommodations with conference and meeting facilities or similar facilities, unquote, change the phrase, exception, no additional parking shall be required for the first 5,000 feet of associated commercial uses or meeting facilities, to no additional parking shall be required for the first 1,500 square feet of associated uses or meeting facilities. In table 9.103.b, change the requirements for dwellings, and this is, quote, dwellings, multifamily, unquote, to 1.5 spaces per unit for studio and one-bedroom units, and 2.0 spaces per unit for 2 or more bedrooms, and change the guest parking to one space for every 5 units. Add the sentence, required employee parking shall be required on-site and shall be free, unquote, to all references to employee parking. In section 9.104, quote, programs and incentives to reduce parking requirements, unquote, throughout this section, add language to specify that any reductions to parking requirements must be approved by a vote of the City Council. And finally, all terms, mixed use and employee parking should have definitions. Thank you. That's outside the
I hear a motion. Is there a second?
motion.
I second that motion.
You want to speak to your second?
Sure. I feel that this is a reasonable approach. It's not overreaching, and I think that we have pretty much agreement from a lot of us that this is where we want to go with the multifamily housing. So I think this is a good option that we can begin the process to adjust the parking. Thank you.
Councilwoman Whitehead?
I guess I would like to make an amendment to the motion to exclude some categories. I don't know if that is a friendly. I think I am not ready to vote on the changes on number 4 office, downtown overlay, in lieu parking, or, I'm okay with the special public improvements. I'm probably okay with the hotel. I would rather continue that, but I would like to see the multifamily wrapped up, and I think that's reasonable what my colleague proposed.
Okay, as the chair of this meeting, I don't think your friendly amendment is specific enough in terms of you're saying to exclude it, and I'm saying I'm listening to that, and is one is to exclude it, and one's to say you're not yet ready to approve it because there may be some change to it that could be acceptable. So that's why it's difficult to extract some of what you've mentioned. I do not hear a second because, and I'm not saying. Yeah, if it's a friendly request, then you're asking the makers of the motion to exclude things that they have already put in the motion. And I don't know that that's going to happen. But that was a request to exclude things. That would mean there would have to be a second meeting and a second action in order to infill that, because it's not yet specific enough. So I don't know that if you'd like to clarify that a little bit, let's see. But, again, I don't have I'm not hearing it now.
I'm gonna offer a second.
You're going to withdraw that, what you said, and restate it.
I will withdraw it, and I will add another what I believe is a friendly amendment, is to alter the motion on the table to change the downtown overlay waiver to 2,000, to continue it, the 2,000 square foot waiver, and up to 2 units. Right now, Councilwoman Littlefield, it reduces it to 500 square feet and 1 unit.
I would just refer to the maker of the motion, and is that acceptable? And the second would have to accept it as well. And do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure which of the issues are you concerned about? Is it table 9.103 with the reducing the 5,000 square foot to 1,500?
It would be on page 26, and it's the item. At the present time, it's written as 2,000 gross square feet they're reducing that, so allowing an addition. Formerly, the code said you could add up to 2,000 square feet and 4 units. And she, I believe, is saying that she would like that to be changed to leave the 2,000 alone and add 1 unit. So not changing the square foot it's two units, but to allow without additional parking. And that I will clarify that again. Page 26, the current code says 2,000 gross square feet of new building or 4 units without adding parking. And it was suggested in your motion that it would be 500 square feet maximum add and only 1 unit. Now the request is for 2,000. Excuse me, could you repeat that?
Yeah, and can I speak to it? The idea of this is that, for instance, on Craftsman Court, you have landowners who have perhaps a tile store or some small business, and perhaps they want to invest in their property and put an additional bookstore on top of that, and then perhaps 2 residential units. So it's a way for a small business, a small landowner, business owner to invest in their property without being impacted. And so to add a retail space, I think 500 square feet is pretty small. So 2,000 square feet, I think is reasonable. These businesses aren't going to invest in that space unless they feel that people can get there and can, come and be patrons of that business. And then I think one thing that we have been looking for is that middle housing where this is something we heard a lot in McKimsey, is these businesses want to have residents that live there full time. So this one item allows a small landowner, it's not the big developer, but the small landowner to add a couple apartments on top within their 36-foot allowance to bring those residents in without having a big monster apartment complex. So I really feel pretty strongly about protecting that to some degree.
Okay, I got you now. Yeah, I'm fine with that.
How about the maker of the second? Are you okay with that? With that change or friendly request?
Yes, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay. To legal now, Mr. Padilla.
Thank you, Mayor and members of council. I thought I heard that the motion was to adopt Ordinance 4500 and Resolution 12141, and then you specified the changes. But one of the things that I thought I heard, and maybe I wrote this down wrong, was that you also wanted to include some either definition or to address mixed use. Did I mishear that? And so if that's true, that's going to require, in essence, right now you don't have any definition or language that you have agreed upon on what would be a proper definition for mixed use. So realistically, your motion...
What I'm trying to get to is dwellings multifamily. So I don't think that's mixed use.
Okay. Yeah, and I was just trying to clarify what that last item was that you were talking about, so that we'll understand how to revise and handle the changes.
Programs and incentives to reduce parking requirements. Throughout this section, add language to specify any reductions in parking requirements must be approved by the vote of the City Council. That has to do with that 20%. We can take that out if it makes.
No, I'm not saying you need to take that out. I'm just trying to make sure I understand. Was there any other item related to this motion that beyond that last item that you just talked about? I just want to make sure I didn't mishear something.
No.
Okay.
Well, at this point, we have Councilwoman Caputi, then Whitehead, and then I have a motion.
A question and a comment. Do we have now that I wasn't thinking about this, but now that it's been brought up, do we have a definition of multi-use? I know Mayor Ortega had asked someone, and maybe Brian Clough could read it out loud for us, or Mr. Graham.
Mayor Ortega, Councilwoman Caputi, we don't have a great definition of mixed use. I mean, the definition is a mix of uses.
Right. It doesn't have to be within one building, right? It's just that area has a mix of uses. Some of them are housing, some of them are commercial, right? It's not like each each development doesn't have to have mixture of uses inside of it.
Correct.
It's the area that's a mixture of use.
In the event that there is a mix of uses, the uses have to park themselves independently. Then there is the opportunity for shared use if you have off-peak times, but the mixed use really doesn't play in as much to the parking requirement, I think, as it does to a land use.
Okay. Well, then in that case, I'm going to make another motion. Since we it looks like we're not going to have any consensus on actually having studies. In fact, I actually think that the way that staff has prepared this is fairly reasonable if we're just going on mainly what other cities have done and lots of hearsay and conjecture. But why don't we make a motion to approve Ordinance 4500? The only thing I'd like to change for sure is this guest parking requirement. I agree with Councilwoman Whitehead. I think maybe one space per 6 would be more appropriate, and maybe that would make everyone happy. So that's my motion.
Well, we had a friendly motion request, and we had a consent from the maker and the second. So that did not require a vote. Now we have a request to change I believe the guest parking from 1 per 5 to 1 per 6, and she phrased it as a motion, not as a friendly request. So is there a second to that motion? Okay. Excuse me, go ahead, legal.
I hate to interrupt, but that motion was to adopt Ordinance 4500. The item is, if you're going to adopt Ordinance 4500, then it also requests that you adopt Ordinance 4500 and Resolution 12141, which is the document that adopts all of the changes in the code. So your motion should include adopting Ordinance 4500 and Resolution 12141.
But that's the motion from the presenter of the motion. Okay. And
did I misunderstand the motion?
You didn't.
You can't have a second motion on it on a main motion, but. Okay. Excuse me. You can turn your mic on. It'll be better.
Sorry, I wasn't overdoing. I wasn't seconding the motion on the floor. I'm bringing a new motion.
And that's what I mean. We can only have one motion on the floor.
Okay, then let's address that one.
So I'm going to make a motion myself, and that motion is that there is a bit of confusion on some of the terminology, and a motion for continuance takes precedent over all other motions, which would mean that I would move for a continuance until May 18th so that all of these questions can be directly answered. I'm not taking offense or giving offense to the motion itself, but I think that there's a bit of incompleteness, especially on the definition of mixed use and the 20%. So I move to continue, but only for 2 weeks. I'm not calling for a study or otherwise on this. Is there a second for a continuance? We have a motion and a second to continue only for 2 weeks. So until May 18th, that would take precedent, and it will get all the clarifications that are needed. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor to continue, please register your vote. Thank you. The matter will be continued and to a date specific with all of the contact